You know, the preservation of football history would be nowhere near it is today without some of the forefathers and trailblazers of early football. Today we're going to talk about a gentleman named Ecke from Chicago, with author Chris Serb, who wrote a biography about him recently. Chris is up in just a moment to tell us all about it.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes at pigskindispatch.com. Welcome to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And before we get to today's guest, let's make sure that you hit the subscribe button and notification bell so you know right when all of our content is coming up on Pigskin Dispatch here on the YouTube channel and the Pigskin Dispatch podcast. And now let's talk to our guest on this great piece of football history. And welcome to another edition where we get to interview an author about a recent book on a football legend. This legend goes way back in time, and his exploits have taken him to many things that we enjoy in the modern game. His name is Walter Eckersall, is the subject of the book. The author's name is Chris Serb. Chris, welcome to the Pig Pen.
Darren, thanks so much for having me. It's I could talk about Eckersall all day, so I'm thrilled to have the forum.
Well, we will get into Eckersall, but I guess before we do that, let's talk about Chris Serb. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself in respect to football and football history, and how you got interested in writing a book about Walter Eckersall?
All right. So I have just always been a sports fan, always loved especially my Chicago sports history. Grew up on my dad's knee. He was a DePaul man. They didn't have a football team at the time, but he would tell me about Amos Alonzo Stagg and the University of Chicago and the history and tradition and the Chicago Bears, of course, locally here. So I just always had an affinity for sports history, for football history, for Chicago sports history, all that good stuff. I was trained as a journalist, have a journalism degree from Northwestern University, was working as a magazine journalist for a couple of years, and then my dream job almost fell into my lap. I got to join the Chicago Fire Department in 1999. I had just turned 29 years old, so I left the full-time journalism world aside and became a full-time firefighter, but I started freelancing right away because firefighters have an ideal schedule for doing projects like writing a book about an obscure sports figure. So we work 24 hours on, 48 hours off. So in those 48 hours, I could do research, I could write articles, have done a few things on, I did War Football was my previous book, which was about World War I era football and how the World War I military teams basically led to the birth of the NFL. That was kind of an interesting take on it. I think the PFRA liked that because they gave me the Nelson Ross Award for that effort. And then my next effort became Ecke, kind of doing a deep dive into this figure whose path I had crossed in my research, but kind of superficially, kind of tangentially had touched upon him before. So I decided to go all in. I decided that would be my next project. And he was even more fascinating than I anticipated.
Well, first of all, thank you for your service as being a firefighter and a lifesaver, and somebody that we can depend on when times are bad. And second of all, thank you for preserving this football history that you have in both war football and here in Ecke that we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, Chris, maybe you could just briefly tell us who Walter Eckersall was and why is he important to football history?
So Walter Eckersall was an athlete here in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. He was the first schoolboy superstar in Chicago sports history. He was a three sports star. He was a champion, a league champion, a state champion, even a national champion in three different sports. He was solid in football. He was solid in baseball. He was solid in track. He was the first high school athlete that got the big photos and the splashy headlines and stuff like that. So he's a pioneer in that respect. And then at the University of Chicago, which was a fairly new university at the time, it was founded in 1892. He arrived there in 1903. The Big Ten itself was fairly new. It was the Big Nine at the time, but it was founded in 1896. He took the University of Chicago to its greatest heights. Um, he was an All Big Ten player for 4 years, or an All Big Nine, I guess at the time. All Big Nine player for 4 years as a quarterback. Now, 3 of those 4 years were before the forward pass, so he was a running quarterback. But in that 4th year, in his senior year, the forward pass was legal, and he was a very good runner still, but he excelled at throwing the ball. It was kind of this newfangled gadget, this newfangled gizmo, and he was very good in very limited duty during that senior year of his. But the real big year, the big deal was 1905 when he led University of Chicago to an undefeated season. They won the national championship retroactively, I guess, the national championship in the Big Ten or the Big Nine championship with a magnificent 2-0 victory over Michigan, which broke their 56 game unbeaten streak. That was the legendary point a minute teams with Fielding Yost as the coach. Willie Heston played on most of those teams, but he didn't play on that 1905 team. He had just graduated. So he was a big deal as a high school athlete, huge deal as a college athlete. He was a 3-time All-American, which was pretty rare at the time, but it was extremely rare. He was the last one until Red Grange to be a 3-time All-American who was not from one of the big three, Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, or maybe you could throw Penn in there. But football, and that was the bias of the people like Walter Camp and Park Davis and stuff who were naming these teams. But they thought that Midwest football just wasn't as good as the East Coast version. But they made an exception for a football genius like Willie Heston, his contemporary, although he was only a 2-time first team All American. Ecke was a 3-time first team All American, the first one from the Midwest and the last one until Red Grange some 20 years later. So he was as a high school athlete, he was tremendous. College athlete, he was tremendous. And then he became the premier sports writer, the lead sports writer for the Chicago Tribune for 20 plus years. He started out as football only writer, but eventually he became a jack of all trades. He covered boxing, he covered track and field, he covered swimming, he was a college baseball beat writer for a couple of years. He covered just random things like archery and shooting and even ski jumping. Basically, if people can compete in something, Walter Eckersall covered it. He was kind of the lens through which Chicagoans, and by extension the country, because he was widely syndicated, he was the lens through which people came to understand their sports at a time when the sports page was really growing and maturing and becoming something that we would recognize today. So fascinating dude for sure.
Yeah, right on the cusp of sports journalism as it's getting out of mixed in with the local news or wherever it would be in your local paper to having its own page. Very interesting. Now, something that just dawned on me, and maybe you knew this already, but I always go back to two early Thomas Edison films when he was developing motion pictures, and one of them was 1904 Chicago Maroons. I think it was against Michigan, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm sure Ecke's in there somewhere, and probably Heston is too. But I don't know if you could identify him because, of course, they don't have numbers and it's a little bit of blurred images. But how fascinating is that? He's probably one of the first filmed football players of all time too.
Yeah, and that's I think that film's preserved on the Library of Congress. I've watched it a couple of times. I've strained my eyes to get a glimpse of Eckersall. I'm sure he's in there. I think that game was at Michigan. That was at the old Ferry Field at University of Michigan, and I think that the cameraman was kind of focusing on the Michigan folks. So it's really hard to pick up glimpses of Eckersall. We could probably pick them out if we slowed it down supremely. I didn't have the time to do such a thing, but it's really fascinating that still exists and that's kind of this little piece of evidence. That game, by the way, Chicago lost. I think it was 22-12. So that was Walter Eckersall's last loss until his senior year when he had a 4-2 loss on a muddy field to Bobby Marshall, another football great, Bobby Marshall, and a great Minnesota team in 1906. But that was those were really epic contests of Giants, and it was really fun to relive that, mostly through reading newspaper accounts. But as you said, we do have the film of that Michigan Chicago game, the a very short little bit of film.
Yeah. No, if I'm not mistaken, did Eckersall, didn't he get into a little bit of officiating football also?
Absolutely. This was kind of a sidelight, but it's an important piece of that third act. This kind of doesn't work with our sensibilities today, but nobody had a problem with it at the time. A lot of sports writers doubled as game officials, and Walter Eckersall was first and foremost among them. He was probably the best known football official in the country from 1907, which was his first year out of college, to until his death in 1930. He was the guy. He officiated the Four Horsemen game, the one that Grantland Rice immortalized, and he was also banging out a story after the fact. So kind of hard to keep your facts straight when you're running up and down and blowing a whistle and determining whether that was a first down or a touchdown. But he was the premier official and officiated games all over the country. He officiated, I believe it was 5 Rose Bowls. He went to every region. He officiated games down south, primarily in the Midwest, but he went wherever the action was, and he loved a good game. He loved a big game. He loved a good intersectional contest. That was a really important part of who Eki was as a sportsman. He really wanted to stay in the game. So he officiating as well as the sports writing was a way that he could stay involved.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it amazing. I was a high school football official for 27 years, and after getting done with the game, I don't know that I could write about it because I really didn't know what was going on other than, when I was a referee, I'm watching the quarterback every play and the interior lineman and, signal a penalty to the press box. I don't know really what's going on the rest of the time except the final score. So I don't know how he did it, but that's pretty amazing feat right there.
Yeah, I think the quality of his journalism declines in games that he officiated. To be honest, he might notice a couple. He might take note of a couple of big plays. Oh, Red Grange had a 40-yard touchdown run, but the rest of the description is pretty generic because that was about the best that he could do when he was calling the proverbial balls and strikes at the time. Calling the first downs and spotting the football and calling penalties and things like that. So kind of by necessity, it had to be a little bit generic, but the people still read it. The people still loved it. And he talked later on in his career. He talked about how being an official just made him a better writer because he was more in tune with the game. Whether that was accurate or not, kind of isn't important. That was his take on it. It was his way of staying involved, of staying really right in the middle of the action, which that was kind of a unique perspective that he had as a writer compared to some of the other folks that were writing about the same games.
Yeah, imagine, I'm not sure if he ever did it, but just getting some of the coaches speak or players speak, Red Grange has a big run and comes back to the huddle. He has the opportunity to say, "Hey, Red, what'd you think about that run?" And maybe he could, I doubt he did it, but just the inside information you would have being, in between the lines as things are going on. That's kind of a cool aspect, which would never go over today. You would be called a homer and probably chased out of every stadium you would go into after you wrote something. But interesting the way football was back then and how people like Eckersall were able to pull double duty at a football game and wearing two hats. So kind of neat.
Definitely, and yeah, something that definitely wouldn't stand today either. But definitely a sign of its times.
Yeah. Well, you alluded to it earlier. He played in the era of when the forward pass was coming in. The most of his playing career was during that brutal time where, there was reports of deaths in football and severe injuries and Teddy Roosevelt's getting involved and football committees are getting, band up and stirred together. Now, but how did he take that as a player, and maybe what are some of the things that he did as a player, both before and after, that maybe stood out?
So it's kind of funny. He was a little guy when he arrived at University of Chicago. He was 5'6" or 5'7". I'm not sure his exact height. He was 132. I think he was listed as a freshman. And by the time he was a senior, he had bulked up. He was somewhere between 140 and 145 pounds. So he was usually the smallest guy on the field. He never wore a helmet. You look at some of these helmets were fairly common at the time, but you can pick out Ecke in a lot of these pictures of game action. It's like, oh, there's the bareheaded guy. He didn't like it. He thought that it held back his style. He had no problem mixing it up. Now he was the quarterback, but as we know, the quarterback was not the way we think of a quarterback today, dropping back and passing until his senior year anyway. But he was the guy that was calling the plays, that was determining, is this going to be inside run, outside run, or is it going to be are there going to be laterals involved, all that stuff. And he had no problem mixing it up, like running right into the middle of a crowd, taking a hard hit, bouncing right off of it, and then scooting for another 10 yards or whatever the case might be. And that's back in the 3 downs to make 5 yards era. You didn't need 10 yards for first down, but you also only had 3 downs. You didn't have 4 downs. On defense, he was always, or almost always, the safety man. He was the guy that played deep back on the field, and if someone broke into the open, he would have to go and make that open field tackle. And a lot of players, a lot of his contemporaries, said that they were surprised at how hard he could hit. This guy that weighs 140 pounds. He was 140 pounds with blazing speed, almost just shy of Olympic caliber speed, and he was definitely a throwback, definitely an old school type of football player, and not the guy that you would expect too. You look at him, what's this guy going to do? He's a little guy. He's a shrimp, but he could dish it out and he could take it.
Yeah, interesting. Now as you alluded to too, he played for one of the most famous college football coaches of all time, a great innovator, somebody that I've put up on that Mount Rushmore of football innovators. Amos Alonzo Stagg. What was Eckersall's relationship with Coach Stagg?
So they were very, very close. There was definitely a mentorship involved, almost a father figure type of thing. Stagg had been at University of Chicago for he was the founding coach, the founding athletic director there. So he had arrived there in 1892, and Eckersall started high school in 1899. He was a JV player as a freshman, and then he was varsity the rest of his time there. And Stagg was coaching at U of C just a mile away, and he would often help out at at Hyde Park High School's football practices. He would loan them their facilities. Hey, come on, guys, come use our gym, come use our football field, host your games at our football field. So he definitely got his hooks into Eckersall early and often, but they were extremely, extremely close. There was a lot of mentorship involved there. Eckersall he was kind of a controversial figure. He was very quietly, just a couple weeks after his senior season ended, maybe 6 weeks after his senior season ended, he was very quietly expelled from University of Chicago. And on what the official documents say were loose morals, and they don't say much more about that. But he had been caught committing a theft. He had been caught stealing, arrested. He made restitution. I think he borrowed some money from his fraternity brothers to pay back the theft. He had stolen a suit from a tailor. So University of Chicago. He had no more PR value to the university, so they kind of quietly expelled him and kind of buried the evidence for decades. A researcher named Robin Lester was the guy who discovered this back in the 1990s, and he was combing through some old records. I think he was actually the guy that organized the Stagg papers and kind of discovered some of this stuff. Hey, wait a second. Stagg was not the wholesome, paragon of pure athletics that we thought, because he did whatever he could to keep Eckersall eligible, but the university was complicit, and then Ecke got expelled, but Stagg and Eckersall remained close after that. Even if the university officials didn't really care for that. They didn't want Ecke hanging around campus, but he was a sports writer, so he had access to campus. He was he would occasionally. There was I think it was 1908. He rounded up some of his 1905 teammates, and they challenged the 1908 team, which was an undefeated Big Ten champion, or I guess it was Big Eight at the time, champion. Challenged them to a scrimmage, and I believe they may have won that scrimmage. That Ecke and his buddies may have won that scrimmage. Whatever it was, they certainly didn't look too rusty, and Stagg loved it. Stagg kind of welcomed him with open arms, and then Coach Stagg. In the I think it was 1917. Eckersall had a drinking problem as a young adult into his middle 30s, I guess. So 1917, he would have been somewhere in his middle 30s. He collapsed in his Tribune office, and this was attributed at the time to exhaustion, but Stagg said that it was because of Eckersall's heavy drinking, and he counseled Eckersall on turning over a new leaf, and Ecke promised him that he would, and they kind of had this fatherly relationship where Stagg could give Eckersall advice, and Eckersall would accept it, and they were extremely close for the rest of their lives. There was friction at various times. There was a story of an unpaid debt that Ecke borrowed $20 or something. I don't know the original source for that story, but that there may have been some friction in the relationship. But all the way up to just a few weeks before Eckersall's death, he secured Stagg some tickets to a Rose Bowl game, and they definitely had a mutual affinity and affection, and they both helped each other to the highest heights of greatness. So it was a mutually beneficial relationship for sure.
Now, did Eckersall ever officiate any of the Maroons games with Stagg on the sidelines?
So the standard at the time, as loose as the standards were, the standard was that you couldn't officiate games involving your own team. And Eckersall abided by this with exactly one exception. During World War I, University of Chicago, I think it was 1918, played a junior college in a midweek game, just kind of an add-on game, and Eckersall officiated that one. I believe that is the only University of Chicago game that he officiated. And early on in his career, he covered a lot of University of Chicago games as a sports writer because University of Chicago was still big news. They won conference titles in 1907 and 1908. They won 1913. They won conference title and a national title. They won a couple conference titles in the 1920s. But Eckersall kind of stayed away from covering University of Chicago after about 1915, 1916, I would say, because he was in such high demand as a game official, and he was making $75 to $100 a pop to cover these games, which in 1915 terms that'd be a couple $1,000s today. So he didn't cover many of Stagg's games after about the 1915, 1916 seasons. He stayed away from that just because it wasn't financially beneficial to him for that. But he still covered practice. He would rely on Stagg for quotes. They maintained an affinity and a friendship. I think Stagg grumbled in a letter about that. Ecke's given me the go by because he wasn't covering University of Chicago games anymore. Certainly nowhere near to the extent that he had done as a young man, as a new sports writer. But there were multiple reasons for that. So yeah, Chicago wasn't as good in the 1920s, certainly, as they were in the Eckersall era and just afterwards. So.
Yeah, few teams that were good at the turn of the century back in the 1920s. Sort of
Right.
a whole new echelon of teams coming up that were sort of planning, or the powers that were earlier. So yeah, interesting.
Right.
So Chris, we've gone this far in, and I don't believe we've told the full title of your book. So why don't you give us the full title and where best place for people to buy it is?
Sure. The title, it's Walter Eckersall and the Rise of Chicago Sports. It's published by University of Nebraska Press, and you can get it directly through University of Nebraska Press. It's also available Amazon, Barnes and Noble, various outlets. It's getting some. There are a lot of outlets, a lot of avenues available for purchasing the book. And I highly recommend it. I hope that all your listeners buy it, because I obviously I'm biased, but I think he's a fascinating guy.
Yeah, there's not too many people that have touched that many aspects of the game of football at that period of time when it was such a delicate thing, almost went out of existence during his playing time. And fascinating. And I'm glad that you've preserved his history. And as a Chicagoan, having that Chicago pride to say, hey, here's one of our guys from, over 100 years ago that had a big, important play in America's favorite game right now. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was one of those things where, as I got deeper into it, I was wondering, how come nobody's told this story before? He was Red Grange before Red Grange existed. He was the Four Horsemen. He was every bit of some of these figures who are mythical. Jim Thorpe, he wasn't that much older than Jim Thorpe, and Jim Thorpe's had dozens of biographies written about him. Red Grange, same boat. Walter Eckersall had exactly one biography written about him prior to this one, and it was a very short, self-published, really amateurish. It was written by an amateur historian back in the 1950s. It was about 40 pages long, and so it was. I couldn't believe that nobody had told this story. I was thrilled that nobody told this story, because it gave me a great opportunity to tell a story about a forgotten hero who, hopefully, now that Ecke is on the record, won't be forgotten any longer.
Yeah, and it's thanks to people like you that are picking up these stories on these forgotten people, making them relevant again, showing their importance to football history or any sport that they've participated in, and great for preservation of history. And we thank you for doing that. And we thank you for joining us here today to share it with us. And again, once you give the title of the book, and as we let you go.
Sure. Once again, it's Ecke, Walter Eckersall, and the Rise of Chicago Sports. My magnum opus so far. We'll see what's next.
All right, Chris. Well, we appreciate you being on today and for preserving that football history.
All right. Thank you so much, Darren. It's been my pleasure.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff, for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.